The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rolling Hills Ranch in Montana as word spread through the small farming community of Clearwater Valley. Old Ben Patterson was dead. The 78-year-old rancher had passed peacefully in his sleep, ending a lifetime dedicated to raising cattle on the same land his grandfather had homesteaded in 1892. But for one particular resident of the ranch, Ben's death meant something far more devastating than the loss of a caretaker. It meant the end of the only friendship he had ever known. In the far pasture, separated from the main herd by a sturdy wooden fence, stood Brutus, a massive Black Angus bull whose reputation had made him an outcast even among his own kind. At 2,200 pounds of pure muscle and standing nearly 6 feet tall at the shoulder, Brutus was an imposing sight that struck fear into the hearts of ranch hands and visitors alike. "That bull's got the devil in him," the locals would whisper. "Attacked 3 men in 2 years. Should have been put down long ago if it wasn't for old Ben's soft heart." What they didn't understand, what no one except Ben had ever bothered to see, was that Brutus wasn't evil. He was heartbroken. The bull had been born on the ranch 12 years earlier, the largest calf anyone had ever seen. His mother had died during a difficult birth, leaving the newborn to be bottle-fed by Ben himself. For the first year of his life, Brutus had followed the old rancher everywhere, as loyal and affectionate as any dog. But as Brutus grew larger and stronger, fear began to replace wonder in the eyes of those around him. When he playfully nudged people the way he had always done with Ben, his massive size sent them sprawling. When he tried to show affection by nuzzling visitors, they saw only a dangerous animal that could kill them with a single movement. The final straw came when Brutus was 3 years old. A new ranch hand named Tommy, ignoring Ben's warnings about the bull's sensitive nature, had tried to impress his girlfriend by showing how tough he was around livestock. He'd struck Brutus with a cattle prod for no reason other than to demonstrate his dominance. Brutus's response was swift and devastating. The bull had knocked Tommy to the ground and stood over him, snorting and pawing the earth. Though he never actually hurt the terrified ranch hand, the incident sealed his fate as a dangerous animal in everyone's mind. "He's got to go, Ben," the ranch foreman had insisted. "That bull's going to kill someone someday." But Ben Patterson saw something different when he looked into Brutus's dark eyes. He saw confusion, hurt, and a desperate need for understanding. Instead of sending Brutus to the slaughterhouse, Ben made a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. He would keep the bull, but separated from the others, where Brutus couldn't be provoked or misunderstood. For 9 years, Ben was the only human who entered Brutus's pasture. Every morning at sunrise, the old rancher would walk to the fence with a bucket of grain and spend an hour talking to the bull as if he were an old friend sharing coffee on the porch. "Morning, big fella," Ben would say, scratching behind Brutus's ears while the massive animal leaned into his touch like a giant cat. "Beautiful day, isn't it? I was thinking we might move you to the south pasture next week. The grass is getting good and thick over there." Brutus would respond with low, rumbling sounds that seemed almost conversational, as if he understood every word. The bull would often rest his enormous head against Ben's chest while the old man scratched his neck, both of them finding comfort in the quiet companionship that had sustained them through years of isolation. When Ben failed to appear for their morning ritual, Brutus knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The bull stood at the fence for hours, calling out with mournful bellows that echoed across the valley. Ranch hands who heard the sound described it as heartbreaking, not the aggressive roar of an angry animal, but the desperate cry of a creature calling for his only friend. "Old Ben's nephew is flying in from Seattle to handle the arrangements," said Sarah Martinez, the ranch foreman who had taken over after Ben's previous manager retired. "He wants to sell the whole place and liquidate all the livestock as quickly as possible." "What about Brutus?" asked Miguel Santos, one of the few ranch hands who had worked long enough to remember when Ben and the bull were inseparable. Sarah's expression grew troubled. "David Patterson made it clear. That bull goes to the slaughterhouse first thing Monday morning. He's not taking any chances with a killer animal while potential buyers are touring the property." Miguel felt his heart sink. He'd watched Ben and Brutus together countless times over the years, and he knew the truth that everyone else seemed blind to. Brutus wasn't a killer. He was just a lonely giant who had been misunderstood his entire life. As news of Ben's death spread through Clearwater Valley, preparations began for a funeral that would honor a man who had been a pillar of the farming community for over 5 decades. The service would be held at the small white chapel in town, followed by burial in the hillside cemetery that overlooked the ranch Ben had loved so much. But 60 miles away in Seattle, David Patterson was making arrangements of his own. Arrangements that would ensure Brutus never had the chance to say goodbye to the only person who had ever truly understood him. The rejected bull stood alone in his pasture, unaware that he had less than 72 hours left to live, still calling out for a friend who would never answer again. Friday morning arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to blanket the entire Rolling Hills ranch. The other cattle grazed peacefully in the main pastures, but Brutus remained motionless by the fence, his massive frame silhouetted against the Montana sky like a monument to grief. Miguel Santos couldn't shake the image of the bull's mournful vigil as he went about his morning chores. By noon, he'd made a decision that could cost him his job, but felt like the only right thing to do. "Sarah," he called out as he found the foreman checking grain supplies in the barn, "I need to talk to you about Brutus." Sarah Martinez looked up from her clipboard, her expression already showing the strain of managing a ranch in transition. "Miguel, if this is about changing Mr. Patterson's mind about the slaughterhouse, don't waste your breath. David Patterson wants that bull gone, and frankly, I can't blame him. The insurance liability alone—" "Just hear me out," Miguel interrupted, something he'd never done in his 15 years on the ranch. "Ben's funeral is tomorrow. That bull has been calling for him for 3 days straight. He knows something's wrong." "Animals don't understand death, Miguel. Maybe not the way we do, but they understand loss." Miguel's voice carried a conviction that made Sarah pause her inventory. "I've seen Brutus mourn before. When his favorite cow died 2 years ago, he didn't eat for a week, and the bond he had with Ben— Sarah, that bull loved him like family." Sarah set down her clipboard, studying Miguel's weathered face. In all their years working together, she'd never seen him this passionate about anything. "What are you suggesting?" "Let him say goodbye. Bring him to the cemetery tomorrow after the service. What's the worst that could happen? If he causes trouble, the slaughterhouse truck is coming Monday anyway." "You want me to transport a 2,200-pound aggressive bull to a public cemetery?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "Miguel, do you hear yourself? He's not aggressive with Ben. He never was. Ben's dead. If this heartbreaking story is touching your soul, like this video and subscribe to the channel to see what incredible decisions Sarah makes about Brutus." The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Through the barn doors, they watched a sleek black SUV pull up to the main house, dust settling around its pristine surface like an accusation against the ranch's rustic authenticity. David Patterson stepped out of the vehicle wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most ranch hands made in a month. At 45, Ben's nephew carried himself with the confident bearing of a successful Seattle attorney who viewed rural Montana as an unfortunate detour in his busy life. "That's him," Sarah muttered, "Ben's heir apparent." They watched as David surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone already mentally converting acreage into dollar signs. His first stop was predictable, the pasture where Brutus stood waiting. "Jesus Christ," David's voice carried across the yard as he approached the fence. "Uncle Ben actually kept this monster all these years?" Brutus raised his massive head at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. For a moment, hope flickered in the bull's dark eyes, until he caught the scent of this stranger who carried none of Ben's familiar warmth. The disappointment seemed to physically deflate the enormous animal. "Sir," Miguel called out, jogging over to intercept David before he got too close to the fence. "I wouldn't recommend—" "You're the foreman?" David cut him off, not bothering to look away from Brutus. "No, sir. That's Sarah Martinez. I'm Miguel Santos. Been working for your uncle for 15 years. "Good. Then you can explain to me why a clearly dangerous animal is still alive on my property." David's tone suggested he was already preparing a lawsuit in his mind. "This bull has attacked people, correct?" Miguel chose his words carefully. "Brutus had some incidents when he was younger, but he's been peaceful for years. Your uncle had a special relationship with—" "My uncle was a sentimental old man who let his emotions cloud his business judgment," David interrupted. This animal represents a massive liability. I want it gone before the estate sale begins. Sir, the funeral is tomorrow. Maybe we could wait until... The truck is coming Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, David said with finality. Make sure the animal is ready for transport. As David strode back toward his SUV, Miguel felt a familiar ache in his chest. The same feeling he'd had as a child watching his father's old dog get put down because they couldn't afford veterinary care. Sometimes doing what was right and doing what was practical were two completely different things. That evening, after David had driven back to his hotel in town, Miguel found Sarah sitting on the porch of her small house at the edge of the ranch property. She was staring out at Brutus's pasture, where the bull remained steadfast in his vigil. He hasn't moved from that spot in 6 hours, she said without looking at Miguel. Hasn't eaten anything either. Miguel settled into the chair beside her. Sarah, I know what I'm asking sounds crazy, but I've been thinking about it, she interrupted. About what you said earlier. About letting him say goodbye. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching as the last light of day painted the mountains purple and gold. In the distance, Brutus's silhouette looked like a statue erected to commemorate faithfulness itself. The cemetery is on the hill overlooking the ranch, Sarah said finally. Ben always said he wanted to be buried, where he could watch over the land. If we brought Brutus up there after everyone else had gone, you're actually considering it. I'm considering whether I can live with myself if I don't. Sarah turned to look at Miguel directly. But if we do this, it stays between us. David Patterson can never know. And if anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong, Miguel said with more confidence than he felt. Brutus just wants to say goodbye to his friend. As night fell over the Rolling Hills Ranch, two humans made a pact to honor the bond between a man and a bull that the rest of the world had never understood. Tomorrow, after Ben Patterson was laid to rest and the mourners had gone home, they would discover whether love and loyalty could transcend even death itself. In his pasture, Brutus continued his lonely vigil, unaware that his chance for one final goodbye hung in the balance of a decision that would define what it truly meant to be human. Do you think Sarah and Miguel are making the right choice, or are they risking everything for a dangerous gamble? Share your prediction in the comments. Saturday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect Montana morning that Ben Patterson had always said was God's way of reminding folks why they chose to live in Big Sky Country. The small white chapel in Clearwater Valley filled with ranchers, farmers, and townspeople who had known Ben for decades, their weathered faces reflecting genuine grief for a man who had embodied the best of rural American values. David Patterson delivered a polished eulogy that touched on his uncle's business acumen and community contributions. But Miguel noticed what was missing. Any mention of Ben's gentleness, his way with animals, or the countless hours he'd spent caring for creatures that others had written off as worthless. As the procession wound its way up the hillside to Clearwater Cemetery, Miguel and Sarah remained behind at the ranch, both wrestling with second thoughts about their planned tribute to Ben's memory. We could still change our minds, Sarah said, watching through binoculars as the funeral convoy disappeared over the ridge. David will never know we even considered this. Miguel looked across the pasture where Brutus stood motionless at the fence, his massive frame somehow conveying both strength and devastating sadness. Look at him, Sarah. That bull hasn't eaten or drunk water in 4 days. He's dying of grief. And if we take him up there and he hurts someone, the only person he ever wanted to hurt was the one who hurt him first, Miguel replied, and Ben made sure that never happened again. An hour after the last car had left the cemetery, Miguel backed the ranch's livestock trailer up to Brutus's pasture gate. To their amazement, the bull walked directly into the trailer without hesitation, as if he understood exactly what was happening. The drive up the winding cemetery road took 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, while Miguel kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure Brutus remained calm in the trailer. When they reached the cemetery, the scene that greeted them was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Ben's grave sat at the highest point of the hillside, marked by a simple granite headstone that read, Benjamin Patterson, 1945 to 2023. He loved this land and everything on it. Fresh flowers covered the gravesite, and the view beyond looked down over the entire Rolling Hills Ranch. Ben's life's work spread out below like a living photograph. Okay, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Let's do this. Miguel opened the trailer gate, and Brutus stepped out slowly, his massive head scanning the cemetery until his eyes found what he was looking for. The bull's reaction was immediate and devastating. A low, mournful bellow that echoed across the valley like a song of pure grief. What happened next left both Sarah and Miguel speechless. Brutus walked directly to Ben's grave with the careful, deliberate steps of a mourner approaching a casket. When he reached the headstone, the enormous bull slowly lowered himself to the ground, something neither of them had ever seen him do, and rested his massive head on the fresh earth that covered his friend. For 20 minutes, the bull remained in that position, perfectly still except for the occasional shudder that ran through his body. It was impossible to interpret his behavior as anything other than grief, pure, unguarded sorrow that was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. My God, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. He knows. He actually knows Ben is here. Miguel was filming with his phone, knowing that no one would believe this without video evidence. But even as he recorded, he found himself setting the device aside to simply witness something that transcended the boundaries between species. Then Brutus did something that would haunt Miguel's dreams for the rest of his life. The bull began to produce soft, rhythmic sounds, not the aggressive bellowing they expected, but gentle rumbles that sounded almost like a lullaby. It was the same sound Ben used to make when he talked to Brutus during their morning visits, and somehow the bull was returning that familiar comfort to his silent friend. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Brutus slowly rose to his feet. He stood for a moment looking down at the grave, then did something extraordinary. He began to back away from the headstone with careful, respectful steps, never turning his back on Ben's final resting place. When he had retreated about 10 feet, Brutus stopped and remained perfectly still, standing guard over his friend's grave like a living monument to loyalty. We need to get him back, Sarah said reluctantly, glancing at her watch. David could return any time. But Brutus seemed to understand. Without any coaxing from Miguel or Sarah, the bull walked back to the trailer and entered it voluntarily, as if he knew his vigil was complete. The return trip to the ranch was silent except for the gentle rumble of the truck engine. When they released Brutus back into his pasture, the bull's entire demeanor had changed. The desperate calling had stopped. The restless pacing was gone. He moved to the center of his field and began to graze for the first time in 4 days. He said goodbye, Miguel murmured in amazement. He actually said goodbye. 3 hours later, David Patterson returned from the post-funeral gathering at the chapel, unaware of what had transpired in his absence. He found Sarah completing her weekend inventory and Miguel repairing a fence in the north pasture. Everything quiet here? David asked, scanning the property with satisfaction. Yes, sir, Sarah replied. Very quiet. David's gaze swept over Brutus's pasture, where the bull was calmly eating grass for the first time since Ben's death. Good. The animal looks more settled. Maybe the stress was just temporary. What David didn't know, what he would never know, was that his uncle's final gift to Brutus hadn't been food or shelter or even protection from those who feared him. It had been the gift of closure delivered by two ranch hands who understood that some bonds transcend death itself. Monday morning arrived with the rumble of the slaughterhouse truck, but the bull that waited in the pasture was not the broken, grieving animal they had expected to find. Brutus walked calmly into the transport trailer, his head held high with a dignity that surprised even the truck driver. Miguel watched from a distance, his heart heavy, but somehow at peace. He thought about the video on his phone, footage of a bull saying goodbye to his friend that would eventually be seen by millions of people around the world, changing forever how they thought about the emotional lives of animals. But more than that, he thought about Ben Patterson's final lesson, that true compassion means seeing the heart that beats inside every living creature, no matter how fearsome or misunderstood they might appear to others. Brutus had been labeled dangerous, rejected by everyone except one old rancher who saw past his size to the gentle soul within. In the end, their friendship had taught an entire community that love knows no boundaries, not of species, not of understanding, and certainly not of death. As the truck disappeared down the ranch road, Miguel whispered a prayer for both Ben and Brutus, two souls who had found in each other what the rest of the world had failed to give them. Unconditional acceptance and love that lasted beyond a lifetime. Rejected bull attends his owner's funeral. You won't believe what happened next.